Hello everyone, welcome back to the Environmental Economics series. We've had a little bit of engagement with the first two, so I think we're going to keep going. This is episode 3, and we're going to talk about just some general concepts about economics and the difference between marginal private and social benefit and externalities, very general topics that are foundational to the subject. And then we're going to get into different types of surveys as promised, and where those surveys can fail and different sources of bias in surveys. But first of all, just some Econ 101 here with this graph. So this is a traditional supply-demand graph. On the y-axis we have price, on the x-axis we have quantity. And then in green we have a supply curve, and in blue we have a demand curve. The demand curve is downward sloping because there are diminishing marginal returns to consumption. So this one, the hypothetical we've got here is about toothbrushes, and that's good that marginal utility declines very, very quickly with toothbrushes, right? Because once you have one, the value of the second one's really low. Like maybe you're willing to pay $5 for your first toothbrush to get a second one to go on vacation and make sure you don't lose them, as I often do when I go on vacations, and be completely lacking a toothbrush. Maybe you pay $2, but then your third one you don't even really have a positive value for. And most goods are like that. If you think about oranges or apples or whatever, your first one brings you a lot of utility. By the time you get to 10 apples, you're tired of apples, right? So the amount you're willing to pay for number 10 is way lower than what you're willing to pay for number 1. Supply is just the opposite, where in order for a supplier to produce the next unit, they have to get a higher price, because again they have input costs, and those input costs are going to increase with the amount of units that they have to manufacture. They might not increase in a linear fashion like this, it's kind of simplified, but they're going to increase nonetheless with each unit. Now where the demand and the supply curve intersect, right here at this red point, that's what we call our equilibrium point. Okay, that's the market clearing price is P1 right here if you follow this point back over to the y-axis. So let's just say that's $2 for a toothbrush. Very generic toothbrush. These are outdated prices if you want a fancy one. And then if we follow this point straight down to the x-axis, this is equilibrium quantity. Let's say that's 1 million toothbrushes per month in the United States or something like that. Well, then that's the amount that will be manufactured, and that's the amount that will be bought. And here, we're at equilibrium. The amount between the market clearing price, this line we drew, and the y-axis, the price axis, and the demand curve, that area, the area of that triangle is called consumer surplus. And it's the total amount of benefit that people buying the good get out of their purchases. And then the area above the supply curve and below this line, from here over back to the price or the y-axis, that's the producer surplus, the amount of utility that the producers get from this amount of goods. And that makes sense, right? Because think about this unit right here. Let's say that's the 100,000th toothbrush. And let's say that this price right here is 50 cents. And if we follow that all the way up to the demand curve, this is $3.50. Okay, so for that 100,000th toothbrush, the producer was willing to sell it for 50 cents but got $2. So they get $1.50 in producer surplus. And the consumer was willing to pay $3.50 but got it for $2, so there's $1.50 in consumer surplus. So if you add up all those producer and consumer surpluses times 1 million toothbrushes and you get the area of this triangle, then that's what you get, is the total. And then consumer surplus plus producer surplus, so consumer surplus plus producer surplus, or this even bigger triangle that would result if we just took all this together. That is just total benefit. That's what everybody gets out of the situation. All right. Now, why did I label demand MPB and supply MPC? Because this is marginal private cost. Private because we're just looking at it from the perspective of the firm or firms selling toothbrushes. And it's marginal private benefit because we're just looking at demand from the perspective of the people buying toothbrushes. There is something else here, which is marginal social benefit and social cost. In the case of toothbrushes, there probably isn't much externality unless you are just really, really averse to bad breath or something. But in other goods and services, there's a high chance for what we call an externality, which is a cost that the producer does not face or a benefit that the consumer does not face from buying something. Another way to think about externalities in kind of a simpler fashion is just side effects. So there are positive or negative side effects to consuming or producing different things that are not always accounted for by this neat and tidy supply and demand chart where we're always at equilibrium. And this assumes, by the way, that marginal private cost roughly equals marginal social cost, and marginal private benefit roughly equals marginal social benefit. Why do I keep saying marginal? What the heck does marginal mean? It means what do you get out of the next good? Not the total units, but the next unit, the unit on the margin. And this is the big revolution of economics that set off the unprecedented boom in human wealth, human living standards, human population, human production that started roughly in the 1700s, is when several economists, notably Smith, Hume, Ricardo, sort of discovered this concept of thinking about things on the margin. Not should we produce a total quantity, should we produce the next unit? How do we think about the next thing that's on the margin and how to make decisions that way? It seems like a small difference, but it radically increased the efficiency of how our societies operate, how companies operate when they make decisions, and how individuals operate. So that's marginal thinking, or margin, thinking on the margin, right? Okay, so let's get into some examples of externalities. So first, a positive externality. The example here is education, and by education I mean education rightly construed, not propaganda, but so let's think about education generally. Traditionally in the United States, we have subsidized K through 12 education. This is differed by region, it's differed through time, but this predates the American Revolution, particularly in New England and post-Civil War. Most states, through most of their history, have had subsidized K-12 education. Now, what's the reason for that? And the answer lies in the difference between the neat supply-demand graph and when you have an externality. So let's first just look at these two lines. This one right here, this is the marginal private cost line, or the supply line, or curve, for education. And then this blue one, that's the demand curve, the marginal private benefit curve for education. So where do these two intersect? Right there. Okay, so if we plot that point and we go over to this axis, here's the equilibrium price for education in whatever unit you want, dollars per year of tuition, total expenditure, whatever. And then if we go down to the x-axis, we get the quantity of, let's say, this is like the number of people getting a K-12 education per year in the U.S. Okay, so that's what we get. But since the 1700s, and even some of our most, you might say, libertarian founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson have recognized and put into place in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that having an educated population has benefits that don't accrue to the individual, they accrue to the society, right? When everyone can read and write and do math, there's probably going to be less crime, there's probably going to be more economic opportunity, you're going to have people who can create jobs for others, people who, they can't get cheated out of a contract because someone tells them, oh yeah, it says this, they can read the contract for themselves. Traditionally in American history, there was also a notion everyone should be able to read the Bible for themselves, so this was also a giant motivating force, particularly, again, among New England, where it was first established, for having public education. And then also just an informed citizenry if you're going to have a republic. People are going to need to know how to think for themselves and make decisions if they're going to live in a republic or a democracy. So, basically, what all that is to say is that the marginal social benefit curve is further to the right. There are more benefits than those that just accrue to the individual. So if you add the benefits from education that accrue to an individual, plus the benefits that accrue to society, then the demand curve should move, or the benefit curve moves to the right, which means what we call the socially efficient equilibrium is where this curve intersects the social cost curve, right? So it should intersect way out here. Now it intersects the actual private cost curve if we're going to keep the thing privatized right up here. But you see there's a higher price, but a much higher quantity down here of, percentage of people who are getting a K-12 education. So you can deal with this a couple of ways. In the statement down here, and this is true for way more than just environmental economics, we get more of what we subsidize. We get less of what we tax. So you should be thinking about that, even just in your private life and thinking about, what policies to enact at the local level or whatever. You get more of what you subsidize, and you get less of what you tax. So you better be careful what you subsidize, and you better be careful what you tax. But anyway, there are a few ways to deal with this and say, okay, we're at this point over here, this privately efficient point, where there are fewer people than we want getting an education based on the fact that if more people got it, there would be benefits to society that didn't accrue to that person, but we'd all be better off. Way one you can deal with it is you can subsidize it, right? You can give like a voucher program is what they're called in our times, in modern times. And that would be the gap between this point and that point. And you give that amount of subsidy, and basically that's going to move the supply curve to the right, out to here. And now the new supply curve will intersect at the socially efficient quantity that you want that's greater than the old quantity. And now this will intersect right there. So that's way one, is you can give a subsidy, and if you want more of it, you give a bigger subsidy. Way number two is a little more straightforward. You can just make it public, which is to say, it's not free, right? There's a cost to it, like you have to tax people to provide it, but making it free means you are making a horizontal supply curve at zero, so that anybody who values an education at more than zero gets one, right? And so you'll get a really high quantity, almost 100%, out here at this equilibrium. That's if you choose to make it public. And what you're saying then is, right, this thing has so many benefits to society that we just don't think you should have to pay for it direct. You should have no disincentive for acquiring this thing. We will make a horizontal supply curve at zero. So unless you value this thing at less than zero, you're going to buy it. So that's that. And then one last thing with the positive externality here. Interesting question, not related to environmental economics. Why does America make K through 12 free and generally has not done the same for college? Because, again, what I was talking about with the assumption about having a population that can do basic reading and writing, has basic math skills, basic science skills, knows the country's history and so forth. Those are benefits that we traditionally have thought those mostly accrue to the community. The benefits of a college education, such as they are, accrue mostly to the individual. In turn, who benefits when you go to law school, right? Arguably the society, arguably not, depending on what kind of lawyer you're going to be, right? But the main beneficiary of that is you, because your salary is higher, right? So the benefits are mostly accruing to yourself and not to the community. So why shouldn't you pay for something where the benefits mostly accrue to you, plus you're now an adult, as opposed to being a 7-year-old second grader, right? So that's why traditionally in America we've had heavily subsidized K through 12, and then college we've said, people can pay for this, with some exceptions like merit scholarships or need-based or whatever, and whatever private universities want to do, they can do. But that's the reason for that distinction, economically speaking. Some common other positive externalities you'll see, some of them are debatable, like the effects of marriage on health, income, and stuff like that. Home ownership, although there's a healthy debate as to whether that's actually an effect you're measuring or whether that's kind of a filter, where the people that that own homes have other attributes in the first place that are more likely to make them productive in the community. And you're not really measuring a cause, you're measuring a correlation associated with an underlying cause. Anyway, so that's a positive externality. We'll erase that. Now we're going to look at a negative externality here. Just making some room. The negative externality is already on the board. Whiteboards are so much better than hearing chalk. All right, so now we have a negative externality here. And the example here is, think about logging in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So like northwestern California, southwestern Oregon, the Douglas fir, and redwood forests out that way. So think about that. It's a place where it's right along the ocean. It has many cool critters, including the Pacific giant salamander, which is one of the largest land salamanders in the United States. Look, it's so big you can just pet his back like a dog.
Like a dog. A dog. And we like totally, I was like, oh, another insect, and I was like, holy moly.
Yeah, so this is what we're thinking about. So on the y-axis we have the price of timber. Again, let's think specifically from Douglas fir and redwoods from the Pacific Northwest. And on the x-axis, as always, we have quantity. Always, always, always. Y-axis is price, x-axis is quantity. Y-axis is price, x-axis is quantity. And in this case, our quantity is the quantity of trees cut in that region. So we have our original supply curve, which again we can think of as our marginal private cost curve. And then we have our demand curve, right? People who want to buy this timber, they're sawmills, maybe they're retailers who need the timber to build homes, they're making paper, whatever the case may be. Here's our demand curve, or marginal private benefit. So what costs does the logging company face? It faces its fuel cost, it faces its employment cost, it faces the cost of permits, to log in a national forest or a state forest, or to rent out the land from private landowners. Most of the land west of the Rockies is public, so most of the logging out there is on national forests. But it faces those costs. It does not face the cost of if it clear cuts a hillside. What you're looking at right here is a clear cut of Douglas fir, both up the hill from us over there and directly behind me. You'll notice in the background there are misty mountains, and that much of the hillside is covered with Douglas fir. Some of it is logged out. The difficulties that the homeowners below might have with increased flooding, because there's no longer an old growth forest to hold back floodwaters when it rains really hard. They don't deal with the cost of increased sedimentation that might kill or degrade, say, a brook trout fishery downstream that brings in millions of dollars in revenue. They don't deal with the cost of the lost carbon sequestration from those trees themselves. They don't deal with the cost of, the lost capacity for air filtration, the lost capacity for recreation, the birders who wanted to go to that forest and see a spotted owl and would have spent hundreds or thousands of dollars to go do that, and now won't anymore. So those things are real costs, but they're not real for the timber company. And that's not to say there's something evil about the timber company, it's just a statement of fact. They don't pay those costs. So for them, those are external or a side effect of their decision-making process. They're just looking at their cost. When there are big costs like that are external to the producer, then the marginal social cost curve will be much higher at every given quantity than the marginal private cost curve. So this is the marginal social cost curve. It integrates, okay, what are the producer's costs plus what are these external ones, right? And so we see if you pick any quantity, this one, that one, this green line is way above this green line, which means the cost is higher. Okay, so here's the difference. If we just take into account the costs of the timber company itself, this is what will happen. You'll get quantity PE, or privately efficient, trees harvested. Let's say that's like billion board feet. And then you have this price, and I don't know much about timber prices, so this is a hypothetical, but let's just say $1 a board foot, a cubic board foot, will prevail. Where the socially efficient equilibrium is very different. You notice if you follow this down to the x-axis, there's a much lower quantity harvested. Looks like about half. So let's call that 500 million board feet. And there's a much higher price for each board foot, reflecting the fact that these are more valuable resources than just a pure private cost, private benefit analysis would have you believe. So let's say this is $2 a board foot. So here's our problem. The quantity that we're going to harvest at a privately efficient solution or equilibrium is much higher than the quantity harvested at a socially efficient equilibrium, and the price is much lower. Okay. And I should note, this doesn't always come into play. You know, if it's purely private property, then I mean, this sometimes doesn't come into play, but if it's public property or it's a national forest or something, then we should probably be thinking about this and doing things the most efficient way. Sometimes it'll be politically expedient, sometimes it won't. So how do we deal with this? Well, there are a couple ways. Kind of the inverse of the subsidy we saw from the positive externality, we could tax, right? You could say for every board foot you harvest, there's some specific tax per board foot, and that would equal this amount, the distance between this price and that price. And then basically this supply curve is going to reflect that added tax by shifting up and staying parallel to the old supply curve and going through the equilibrium point you want it to. Where now, okay, now we're harvesting the socially efficient quantity at the socially efficient price. That should be an S, not a P right there for socially efficient. Okay, so that's one way to deal with it as a tax, the inverse of a subsidy, right? You get more of what you subsidize, you get less of what you tax. So if you tax harvesting timber, you're going to get less timber harvested. The other way you could do it is just simply a ban or a quota. And you can think of a ban as a quota set to 0. So what does that look like? Here's what it looks like. This is the market for sulfur dioxide emissions in the United States. SO2 emissions. Sulfur dioxide, let's say that's tons, and price is dollars per ton emitted. Sulfur dioxide is the main chemical that when you burn coal produces acid rain. When it gets into the atmosphere, rain falls through it, it becomes acidic, and especially through like the late 70s and 80s, this was a big problem in the eastern US with forests dying off, or at least a portion of them dying off due to acid rain. Most coal production in the US takes place either in Wyoming or in sort of the eastern part of the country. A lot of it gets burned in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Indiana. And prevailing winds in the U.S. blow to the east, so the states there and then eastward into the kind of the Blue Ridge part of the Appalachians historically had a problem with acid rain. So here is the supply curve that is the marginal private cost of emissions, right? That's just the cost of setting up a coal plant, paying your workers, buying the coal from someone who's mining it, so forth. So just the firm's cost. And here's the demand curve. Also thought of as the marginal benefit curve. So that's the revenue that the company earns, the power plant company earns, when they burn this coal and then sell the electricity that it generates. So there's the demand curve for SO2 emissions. Here's the thing. What if there were a quantity of sulfur dioxide emitted where the marginal cost curve, or excuse me, the social cost curve stayed pretty close to the marginal private cost curve until it just like went really steep because once you hit this quantity, you're putting enough in the atmosphere, it's going to kill trees. If you're only putting this much in the air, it's not really going to do much damage to the environment. That's kind of okay. But once you hit here, it gets really, really steep because there's a set concentration that trees can't handle. So our marginal social cost curve gets ridiculously steep right there. Well, what if you have that? It's kind of awkward to do a tax based on this, because if the supply curve moves parallel, it still won't really mimic the social cost curve, and that's what you want it to do. So how about instead you just say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set a quota. That's the total amount you can possibly consume. Quota, which is it's a new supply curve. And the government says, 8.9 times, like 8.9 billion tons a year. That's all that can be put into the atmosphere. Well, then what happens is there's no way to emit more than that. And they say, okay, we're going to put up permits, and if you want to submit a ton of SO2, you bid on the permits. And the people who bid the highest win the permits, because they're the ones who are burning coal most efficiently and producing electricity with it at the highest profit, and who need the permits the most. And then they're able to trade their quota with other electricity producers if they want to. This is called a cap and trade system. It was proposed for CO2 back in 2009, and the bill did not go through. SO2 and CO2 are very different chemicals, so I will not make a comment on that political-wise. But anyway, you're doing this because the damage curve is so steep, you just under no circumstances do you want more than this emitted, where, say, the spruce fir forest and the Smokies start dying. So you set it right here, and then this is the only possible equilibrium point. Well, given the current demand curve, is right here at a higher price, P socially efficient, Q socially efficient, and the amount of tonnage you want. Well, what if demand goes up? Well, it doesn't matter, because the amount of the quota doesn't change. So if demand goes up, quantity won't adjust at all, as in a traditional supply-demand model. All that'll happen is the price will go up. Price socially efficient, new. Or if demand goes down, vice versa, the price will just go down, but the quantity will remain the same. So you can think of banning something in graphical terms as an economist. Banning something is putting a quota right at zero, so that you'll never have an equilibrium where quantity exceeds zero. That's banning something. So a ban is really just a species of quota when you think about it. But so quotas, those are used more, like I said, when the cost curve or the damage curve, the marginal social cost curve, gets really steep really quickly. Or at least that's when they're used smartly. Okay, so what we've looked at so far is, how does traditional supply-demand work? Why? What's positive externality look like? How do we deal with it? What's a negative externality look like? How do we deal with it? Had some one example of that, logging. There's some other common examples for negative externalities, like burning SO2, as we just looked at, heavy industry, crime, social pathologies, things like that. When you see a supply curve, be thinking about it as a damage curve, both in the financial sense and the environmental sense. Like, how much resources do you have to give up or relinquish in order to produce this amount of stuff? And again, I can't stress enough, you get more of what you subsidize, you get less of what you tax. You get more of what you subsidize, less of what you tax. And really, this whole externality discussion, it's a lead-in to why we need environmental economics, or at least the valuation part of it in the first place. Is if there are external costs to doing something, or external benefits to doing something, that aren't readily measured by the existing market, then you need some way, even if it's imperfect, of valuing those things to make decisions, at least when you're dealing with publicly managed resources, like public land or national forests or air quality or something like that. I mean, where do you buy clean air? There's no developed market for it, so you need some way to try to measure what's that worth, So anyway, with that, we're going to transition into looking at one way of trying to value non-market goods, which is giving people surveys, and a couple different types of surveys, and places where they can fall into trouble if they're not done right.